What if everything you take to be real is only a shadow, and the world you have learned to navigate with confidence is a representation of something you have never actually seen? Over 2,300 years ago, a Greek philosopher described a group of prisoners chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, and called it a picture of the human condition. Tonight I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The Allegory of the Cave is one of the most read philosophical texts in history, but reading it as a metaphor is not the same as understanding what Plato was using it to argue, and the argument is considerably more radical than the metaphor alone suggests. Tonight, we turn to a philosophical image that has endured for over 2 millennia because it describes something about the relationship between knowledge, perception, and resistance to truth that has not stopped being accurate. The question is not only what the allegory means, but what it demands of the person who takes it seriously.
The allegory of the cave is not a gentle invitation to think more carefully. It is a claim that most people, most of the time, are mistaking representations for reality, and that this mistake is not accidental but structural, built into the conditions of ordinary human experience.
We are speaking about Plato's Allegory of the Cave, one of the most consequential philosophical images in Western thought, and about what Plato was actually arguing when he wrote it.
The allegory appears in the 7th book of the Republic, which is not a book about epistemology in isolation, but a book about justice, political authority, and the structure of the ideal state. The cave is not a standalone thought experiment. It is the central image of a comprehensive argument about how knowledge, power, and social organization are connected.
Then let us begin with the image itself and with what Plato is describing before we turn to what he is arguing.
Plato asks us to imagine prisoners who have been chained in an underground cave since birth, positioned so that they can only look at the wall directly in front of. Behind them, at a distance, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, other figures move objects along a low wall, much like puppeteers behind a screen. The light of the fire casts shadows of these objects onto the wall, the prisoner's face. These shadows are all the prisoners have ever seen. They have no experience of the objects themselves, of the fire, or of anything beyond the cave. For these prisoners, the shadows are not representations of something else. They are reality. They name the shadows, predict their movements, and build a complete understanding of their world around them. They are not stupid or incurious. They have simply never had access to anything other than the shadows. Their intelligence operates on the only data available to them.
So the prisoners are not failing to think. They are thinking correctly given what they can see.
Yes. And here's the first thing we need to correct about the standard reading. The allegory is sometimes presented as a story about stupid or ignorant people, who simply have not thought hard enough. Plato is making a more uncomfortable claim. The prisoners represent the normal human condition, not an exceptional failure. The cave is where most people live, and the chains that hold them are not personal weaknesses, but the structural conditions of ordinary experience. Now imagine, Plato says, that one prisoner is freed and compelled to turn around. The first experience is painful. The fire is blinding. The objects that were casting the shadows are strange and hard to interpret. Everything the prisoner thought he knew is suddenly unreliable. His first instinct is to turn back toward the familiar shadows.
So the initial response to genuine knowledge is pain and disorientation, not enlightenment.
Precisely. And this detail is essential to Plato's argument. The transition from ignorance to knowledge is not a pleasant experience. It requires leaving behind a world you understood for a world that is initially overwhelming and confusing. The natural human response to this transition is resistance. And Plato insists on naming that resistance rather than pretending that truth is simply attractive once encountered. If the prisoner is dragged further, out of the cave entirely, the experience is even more painful. The sunlight is blinding. He can see nothing at first. Gradually, as his eyes adjust, he begins to make out shadows on the ground outside the cave. Then reflections in water. Then the objects themselves. Then the sky. And finally, the sun itself. Each stage represents a deeper level of reality, moving from representation toward the source.
So even outside the cave there is a gradual process of adjustment before full understanding is possible.
Yes, and the sun in Plato's allegory is not simply a convenient light source. It is the symbol of what he calls the form of the good, the highest and most fundamental principle of his philosophical system. Just as the sun makes everything visible by providing light, the form of the good makes everything knowable by providing the ultimate standard of truth and value. To understand, The sun is to understand the source of reality itself. This is the turning point in the allegory and in Plato's argument. The allegory is not simply a description of the difference between ignorance and knowledge. It is a description of levels of reality. The shadows in the cave are least real, the objects that cast them are more real. The world outside the cave is more real still, and the sun, the form of the good, is the most real thing of all, the ultimate ground of everything else.
So the allegory is not only about how we know things, but about what kinds of things there are to be known?
Exactly. This connects to the core of Plato's metaphysical system, his theory of forms. For Plato, the particular things we encounter in the world, this chair, this instance of beauty, this act of justice, are imperfect and temporary instances of eternal, unchanging forms. The form of beauty is more real than any beautiful thing. The form of justice is more real than any just act. The philosopher is the person who trains their mind to move from the particular to the form, from the shadow to the thing itself. The final stage of the allegory is the one with the most direct political consequences. The freed prisoner, having seen the sun, is then required to return to the cave. He goes back into the darkness, and his eyes, now adjusted to sunlight, can no longer see the shadows clearly. The other prisoners who have never left regard him as someone whose sight has been damaged by the journey. When he tries to tell them what he has seen, they do not believe him. If he tries to free them, the text suggests they would rather end his life than accept his account.
So, the return is more dangerous than the journey out.
Yes, and Plato is almost certainly thinking of Socrates, who was tried and executed by the citizens of Athens for corrupting the youth and impiety. Socrates spent his life asking people to examine their assumptions, and found that they preferred to end his life rather than continue the examination. The allegory is in part a philosophical interpretation of what happened to his teacher, but the political argument embedded in the return is also a positive one. Plato argues that those who have seen the sun, who have achieved genuine philosophical knowledge, have an obligation to return to the cave. They do not get to remain in the sunlight, contemplating the forms. The philosopher must become a ruler, or the ruler must become a philosopher. This is the foundation of his concept of the philosopher king. Only those who have genuine knowledge of the good have the right to govern, and those who have it are required to use it in the service of the community.
So the allegory is not just about individual enlightenment, it is about political obligation.
Precisely. And this is where Plato's argument becomes most uncomfortable to modern readers. He is not arguing for democratic consultation of the general population. He is arguing that most people are stuck in the cave, that their political opinions are based on shadows, and that the proper form of governance is ruled by the few who have escaped and returned. The Republic is not a celebration of democratic participation. It is a sustained argument against it. The context of the Republic is a dialogue conducted by Socrates with several interlocutors, including Glaucon, Plato's brother, who draws out the cave allegory through question and response. The dialogue form is not merely a stylistic choice. It is a philosophical statement about how knowledge is acquired. Genuine understanding, Plato believed, cannot be delivered in a lecture. It must be drawn out through questioning, challenge, and sustained engagement. The form of the text enacts the epistemology it describes.
So the way the Republic is written is itself an expression of the allegory's argument about how learning works.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons the text has survived as a philosophical touchstone for so long. It does not simply describe a method of inquiry. Reading the Republic as a reader who asks why Socrates is making each move, rather than simply accepting the conclusions, puts the reader in the position of Glaucon, participating in the very process the allegory describes. The line of the divided line, which appears just before the cave allegory in the Republic, is the technical philosophical framework that the allegory dramatizes. Plato divides reality into two main regions, the visible and the intelligible, and each of those into two levels. In the visible region, shadows and reflections are less real than the physical objects that cast them. In the intelligible region, mathematical objects understood through hypothesis are less real than the forms grasped through pure reason. The cave maps directly onto this structure. The shadows on the wall correspond to shadows in the visible world, the fire to the sun, and the journey out of the cave to the ascent from visible to intelligible.
So, the allegory is a narrative illustration of a technical philosophical argument.
Yes, and understanding this connection changes how we read the allegory. It is not a freestanding parable about enlightenment in general. It is a precise illustration of a specific claim about the structure of knowledge and reality. The prisoners are not simply ignorant people. They are people whose cognitive access is limited to the least real level of existence. The philosopher is not simply a wiser person. The philosopher is someone whose reason has been trained to apprehend the forms, the most real things there are. The mathematical training that Plato prescribes for the philosopher rulers in the Republic is directly connected to the cave. Mathematics for Plato is an intermediate step between the visible world and the forms. Mathematical reasoning requires moving away from sensory experience toward abstract relationships that are true independently of any particular instance. A student who genuinely understands why the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides has grasped something that is true in every possible world, not just in the triangles they can draw. This kind of grasp is the beginning of the turn toward the sun.
So mathematics for Plato is not a technical skill, but a philosophical training ground.
Precisely. It trains the mind to recognize that some truths are not dependent on observation and cannot be revised by experience. Once the mind accepts that there are truths of this kind, it is prepared to consider whether the forms, the ultimate objects of philosophical knowledge, might be truths of the same kind at a higher level. The cave, the divided line, and the mathematical curriculum are three parts of a single argument about what kind of knowing is most reliable and most real.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to read the allegory in its full context and engage with Plato's broader argument, where would you invite them to continue in?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with the Republic by Plato.
So this is not only the source of the allegory, but one of the founding texts of Western philosophy.
Through a series of dialogues, the Republic explores questions about justice, knowledge, and the structure of an ideal society. The allegory of the cave appears within this work as a central metaphor for understanding the difference between perception and reality, and the role of education in guiding individuals toward truth. The book continues to shape discussions in philosophy, politics, and education, offering a foundational perspective on how humans seek and understand knowledge.
Is it accessible to readers without prior philosophical training?
The dialogue form makes it more accessible than many philosophical texts. Plato writes through characters in conversation, which means the argument unfolds through exchange rather than through systematic exposition. A good modern translation makes the text readable without specialized preparation. The seventh book, where the cave allegory appears, can also be read as a self-contained section, though the broader argument gives it much more depth.
So, the reader can enter the cave first, and then work outward into the full argument.
Precisely, and reading the allegory in context transforms it. What seems like a metaphor about personal enlightenment becomes a political argument about power, knowledge, and the obligations of those who govern. The cave is much harder to dismiss once you understand what Plato is building with i.e.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of the Republic and the cave allegory was the Platonic tradition in philosophy, which shaped the development of Western thought for over a millennium. Neoplatonism, which flourished in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, developed the theory of forms into an elaborate hierarchical metaphysics. Early Christian theology absorbed Platonic ideas about the soul, the immaterial realm, and the relationship between the temporal and the eternal. The allegory of the cave became one of the standard reference points for discussions of how divine or transcendent truth relates to ordinary human experience. The educational implications of the allegory became a foundational concept in the philosophy of education. Plato argues explicitly that education is not the putting of knowledge into a mind that lacks it, as one might fill an empty vessel. Education is the turning of the soul, the reorientation of the mind's attention from shadows toward reality. This means that genuine education is not primarily about transferring information, but about transforming the direction in which a person looks. It is a fundamentally different model from most contemporary approaches to schooling.
So education for Plato is less about filling a mind.
Yes, and this distinction has significant consequences for how we think about what schools are for, what teachers do, and what counts as genuine learning. If education is turning rather than filling, then the role of the teacher is not to transmit correct answers but to provoke the kind of disorientation that forces the student to re-examine what they thought they knew. The Socratic method, with its relentless questioning and its refusal to simply provide conclusions, is the pedagogical expression of this view. The modern applications of the cave allegory are numerous, and not all of them Plato would have recognized. The allegory has been applied to the experience of consuming media, where audiences receive representations of reality constructed by others, rather than direct experience. It has been applied to political propaganda, where populations are kept within a carefully managed information environment. It has been applied to social media, where algorithmic curation creates individualized caves in which each person sees a shadow world tailored to reinforce existing beliefs.
So the cave keeps being rebuilt with new materials in each generation.
Yes, and the allegory remains useful precisely because it does not depend on the specific technology through which the shadows are produced. Whether the shadows come from a fire and puppets, from a printing press, from a television screen, or from an algorithm, the structural situation is the same. People receive representations of reality mediated by processes they do not control and may not be aware of, and they tend to mistake those representations for reality itself. The complications of Plato's argument are real and deserve acknowledgement. His conclusion, that the philosopher king should govern because only philosophers know the truth, is one of the intellectual foundations of what Karl Popper called the open society's enemies. The claim that a small group of specially trained individuals possess genuine knowledge, and should therefore govern the rest, is not a benign philosophical position. It has historically provided justification for authoritarianism of various kinds. Plato's cave can be read as a description of epistemic humility, or as a justification for epistemic elitism, and the difference between those readings matters enormously.
So the allegory is a tool that can be used to liberate or to dominate depending on who is holding it?
Yes, and this is perhaps its most enduring lesson. The person who tells you that you are in a cave and they have seen the sun has made a claim that is either the most valuable thing anyone could offer you, or one of the most dangerous. The difference depends entirely on whether they are right, and on whether the process they propose for leaving the cave is genuinely open to revision, or is simply the installation of a new and better lit set of shadows. The modern relevance of the allegory is perhaps sharpest not as a description of other people's ignorance, but as a question addressed to each reader individually. In what ways are you still in the cave? What are the shadows you have mistaken for reality? What is the fire whose light you have not yet turned to see? These questions are uncomfortable, because they cannot be answered with confidence. The person who is most certain they have left the cave may simply have found a more elaborate set of chains. The tension between Plato's description of the cave and his proposed solution to it is one of the most productive tensions in the history of political philosophy. He diagnoses correctly that most political opinion is based on incomplete or distorted information, on shadows rather than on reality. His proposed solution, ruled by those who have seen the sun, assumes that such people can be identified reliably, and that their knowledge of the good translates directly into political wisdom. Both assumptions are contestable. The history of self-declared philosopher kings does not support optimism about either.
So the diagnosis is more durable than the cure?
Yes, and this is perhaps the most honest way to use the allegory today, as a description of a real epistemic problem without a settled political solution. The cave tells us something true about how human perception works and how resistant it is to revision. It does not tell us who should govern. Those are separate questions, and conflating them is precisely the move that has made Plato's political conclusions so persistently dangerous.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the chains, the fire, the painful journey toward the sun, and the dangerous return to the cave that Plato argues is the obligation of everyone who has made it.
Plato reminds us that the most difficult part of acquiring knowledge is not the journey out of the cave. It is the willingness to go back in.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.